When an experienced hiker and her 3-year-old son vanished without a trace in Wyoming's Grand Teton National Park, searchers found only a broken watch and shattered hopes. 4 years later, climbers discovered something in a remote ice crevice that would transform a tragic accident into a chilling criminal investigation. The truth behind their disappearance was more sinister than anyone imagined, hidden in military secrets in a cabin of horrors. But even after justice was served, one haunting question remained. What happened to little Leo? Before we continue with the story, tell us where you're watching from and how old you are, and subscribe to our channel to receive new stories every day that will thrill your heart. I hope you enjoy the story. The evening light filtered through the kitchen window of the modest 2-story home nestled at the edge of Jackson, Wyoming, casting long shadows across the worn wooden table where James sat, his coffee growing cold in the ceramic mug Sarah had painted for him last Christmas. The cheerful sunflower design seemed to mock him now as he stared at his phone for the 100th time, willing it to ring, to buzz, to show any sign of life from the woman who had left that morning with their 3-year-old son for what should have been a simple afternoon hike. Sarah Mitchell was not the type of woman to be late without explanation. In their 7 years of marriage, James had learned to read the careful precision with which she approached everything, from the way she methodically checked her gear before each climb, to how she would text him updates every few hours during longer excursions. She was a creature of habit, born from years of mountain experience that had taught her the deadly consequences of carelessness. Her hiking boots, scarred from countless adventures, sat by the back door most evenings, but this morning they had carried her and Leo into the vast wilderness of Grand Teton National Park, and now the silence stretched like a chasm between James and his family. The last photograph she had sent glowed on his phone screen, a beacon of normalcy in his growing panic. Sarah's face beamed at the camera, her auburn hair escaping from beneath her well-worn baseball cap, freckles dancing across her sun-kissed cheeks. Behind her, Leo perched in his bright blue camping backpack, specially designed for toddlers, his chubby hands gripping the straps while his gap-toothed smile mirrored his mother's joy. The timestamp read 2:47 p.m., and the background showed the familiar wooden trail marker of the Jenny Lake Loop, a beginner-friendly path Sarah could have navigated blindfolded. James ran his thumb across the phone screen, as if he could somehow reach through the digital image and pull them both back to safety. The anxiety that had been a whisper in the back of his mind all afternoon now roared like a freight train. Sarah had promised to be back by 5, maybe 6 at the latest, accounting for Leo's shorter legs and frequent stops to examine interesting rocks or chase butterflies. It was now past 8, and the Wyoming sun was painting the Teton peaks in brilliant oranges and purples, a vista that usually filled James with wonder, but now seemed ominous, like a beautiful curtain falling on his world. He dialed Sarah's number again, listening to the hollow ring that seemed to echo in the growing darkness outside. 1 ring, 2 rings, 3 rings. Then her voice, bright and cheerful in the voicemail greeting, promising to call back when she found signal. The beep that followed felt like a small death, and James found himself unable to speak, simply ending the call and setting the phone down with trembling hands. The house felt enormous around him, filled with the echoes of morning laughter and Leo's excited chatter about seeing big mountains and maybe bears, but safe bears. Sarah's morning coffee mug sat unwashed in the sink, lipstick still faintly visible on the rim, and Leo's favorite stuffed elephant sat abandoned on the living room couch, waiting for its owner's return. These small remnants of normalcy felt like artifacts from another lifetime, evidence of a world where his family was whole and safe, and would walk through the front door at any moment. James moved to the window, pressing his forehead against the cool glass as he stared out at the Teton Range silhouetted against the darkening sky. Somewhere out there, beyond the comfortable lights of town, Sarah and Leo were lost in circumstances he couldn't fathom. Sarah knew these mountains like old friends, had climbed technical routes that would challenge seasoned mountaineers, yet here he sat, helpless and afraid, while his family remained somewhere in that vast wilderness. His hands shook as he scrolled through his contacts, finding the number he had hoped never to need. Marcus Thorne, Grand Teton National Park's chief ranger, was a man James had met only once, at a community barbecue where Sarah had introduced him as the guy who knew every rock and tree in the park. Thorne had laughed then, his weathered face creasing into smile lines earned through decades of mountain rescue operations. Now, as James prepared to make the call that would change everything, he prayed that experience would be enough to bring his family home. The conversation with Marcus was brief but thorough, the ranger's voice shifting from casual professionalism to focused concern as James recounted the details. The Jenny Lake Loop was an easy trail, Marcus confirmed, popular with families and tourists, well-marked and well-traveled. For an experienced hiker like Sarah to go missing there was unusual, concerning in ways that neither man wanted to acknowledge aloud. Marcus immediately began organizing a search team, promising to start with the obvious places and work outward from there, his words carrying both reassurance and underlying tension, born from years of mountain rescues that didn't always end in reunions. As darkness settled over the valley like a heavy blanket, James found himself trapped in a liminal space between hope and despair. The rational part of his mind insisted there must be a simple explanation, perhaps a twisted ankle that had forced them to shelter for the night, or a detour to show Leo some interesting wildlife that had taken longer than expected. But the growing knot in his stomach told a different story, whispering possibilities too terrible to contemplate. The search began immediately, with Marcus coordinating teams of park rangers, local volunteers, and mountain rescue specialists who knew the terrain intimately. Powerful flashlights cut through the darkness as searchers spread out along the Jenny Lake Loop and its connecting trails, their voices calling Sarah and Leo's names into the wilderness. The sound echoed off the granite walls of the Tetons, returning empty and hollow, as if the mountains themselves were keeping secrets. James waited at home, pacing the floors that creaked under his restless footsteps, his phone clutched in his white-knuckled grip as he waited for updates that came in sporadic bursts. The searchers found the trail markers Sarah had photographed, confirmed the route she had intended to take, but beyond that last image, she and Leo seemed to have vanished as completely as if they had never existed. No footprints in the soft earth beside the trail, no discarded water bottles or granola bar wrappers, no signs of struggle or distress, nothing to indicate which direction they might have gone or what might have befallen them. The house grew colder as the night deepened, and James found himself unable to turn on the heat, as if maintaining the chill might somehow preserve the moment before everything went wrong, might keep alive the possibility that Sarah and Leo would walk through the door at any moment, full of apologies and stories about their unexpected adventure. But as the hours crawled by and the search teams returned empty-handed, exhaustion replacing urgency in their voices, James began to understand that his family had stepped into a void from which they might never emerge. The coffee in his mug had grown completely cold hours ago, forming a thin skin across its surface, and outside, the vast Wyoming sky blazed with stars that seemed distant and indifferent to his anguish. Somewhere in that darkness, beyond the reach of flashlights and the sound of searching voices, his wife and child had become part of a mystery that would haunt the mountains and consume his life in ways he could never have imagined. The morning of the third day brought a deceptive sense of hope as dozens of searchers spread across the Grand Teton wilderness like a human net, their bright orange vests creating spots of color against the muted greens and browns of the Wyoming landscape. Marcus Thorne stood at the makeshift command center that had been erected in the Jenny Lake parking lot, his weathered hands wrapped around a steaming cup of coffee that had grown cold hours ago, his eyes scanning the topographical maps spread across folding tables weighted down with rocks to prevent the mountain wind from scattering them into the forest. The search had expanded beyond the Jenny Lake Loop into the more remote areas of the park. Teams of volunteers and professional rescuers methodically combing through dense stands of lodgepole pine and across boulder fields where a misstep could prove fatal. Each searcher carried radios that crackled with periodic updates, mostly negative reports that added another grid square to the growing map of areas where Sarah and Leo were not. The systematic elimination of possibilities felt both necessary and heartbreaking, each cleared section bringing them closer to the terrible conclusion that mother and child had simply vanished from the face of the earth. James had joined the search despite Marcus's gentle suggestion that he might be better served waiting at home, his civilian presence adding an element of unpredictability to the carefully orchestrated operation. He moved through the forest with desperate energy, calling Sarah's name until his voice grew hoarse, examining every overturned rock and fallen log as if they might contain clues invisible to trained searchers. His amateur enthusiasm bordered on reckless, and more than once Marcus had to redirect him away from dangerous terrain, where his grief-driven urgency might lead to another tragedy. It was Jennifer Walsh, a seasonal ranger with sharp eyes honed by 5 summers of backcountry patrol, who made the discovery that would reshape the entire investigation. She had been assigned to research the immediate area around the last known photograph location. Her instructions to examine the ground with forensic precision for any evidence previous teams might have overlooked. The morning sun slanted through the pine canopy, creating a dappled pattern of light and shadow that made small objects difficult to spot. But something metallic caught her attention as she knelt to examine a cluster of alpine wildflowers growing beside the well-worn trail. The watch lay partially buried beneath a thin layer of pine needles and forest debris, its silver face cracked in a spiderweb pattern that suggested violent impact. Jennifer's gloved hands trembled slightly as she carefully brushed away the organic matter, revealing the distinctive curved band and elegant numerals that marked it as an expensive timepiece. The leather strap had been torn, one piece still attached to the case while the other lay several inches away, as if ripped apart by sudden force. She photographed the watch from multiple angles before carefully placing it in an evidence bag, her training overriding the excitement that threatened to make her hands unsteady. The radio crackled to life as Jennifer reported her find, her voice carefully controlled, despite the significance of what she had discovered. Within minutes, Marcus arrived with James close behind, both men moving with the urgent energy of people who understood that this small piece of metal and leather might hold the key to everything. The site was immediately cordoned off with yellow tape, transforming a few square feet of forest floor into a crime scene that would be photographed, measured, and analyzed with scientific precision. James's reaction upon seeing the watch was immediate and visceral, his face draining of color as recognition struck him like a physical blow. His knees buckled slightly, and Marcus steadied him with a firm hand on his shoulder, as James stared at the evidence bag containing the timepiece he had saved for months to buy, the anniversary gift he had presented to Sarah with such pride just 18 months earlier. She had worn it every day since, the weight of it on her wrist becoming as natural as breathing, and seeing it broken and abandoned in the wilderness felt like discovering a piece of her soul discarded among the pine needles. The watch face had stopped at 3:17, frozen in time like a photograph of the moment when everything went wrong. The crystal was shattered in a pattern that suggested impact from multiple directions, as if the watch had been caught between rocks during a fall, or perhaps damaged during a struggle. James found himself fixated on those stopped hands, wondering what Sarah had been doing in that crucial minute, whether she had been conscious when the watch broke, whether she had called out for help that never came. Marcus examined the scene with the methodical thoroughness of a man who had worked dozens of mountain rescues, noting the position of the watch relative to the trail, measuring distances, and photographing everything from multiple angles. The location was approximately 500 meters from the parking area, well within the range of the standard day hike Sarah had planned. But the condition of the watch suggested something more sinister than a simple stumble or momentary disorientation. The torn leather and shattered crystal painted a picture of violence, or at least sudden trauma, that seemed inconsistent with Sarah's reputation for careful, measured progress through the wilderness. The discovery energized the search teams in ways that both hopeful and ominous. On one hand, they finally had a concrete piece of evidence, something tangible that proved Sarah and Leo had indeed been on this trail. On the other hand, the condition of the watch suggested that whatever had happened to them was sudden, violent, and had occurred close to their starting point, raising uncomfortable questions about why they had not simply walked back to safety. The search pattern was immediately recalibrated, with teams focusing their efforts in a radius around the discovery site, examining every gully, every cluster of boulders, every place where someone might have fallen or taken shelter. As the hours passed and the search teams returned with empty hands, a narrative began to emerge among the investigators that would shape the official explanation for Sarah and Leo's disappearance. The theory was logical, even compelling in its simplicity. Sarah had suffered some kind of accident, perhaps a slip on loose rocks or a twisted ankle that had damaged her watch in the fall. Disoriented by injury and responsible for a frightened 3-year-old child, she had wandered away from the main trail seeking help or shelter, becoming increasingly lost in the maze of game trails and false paths that crisscrossed the wilderness. This explanation satisfied the need for closure while acknowledging the harsh realities of mountain rescue. Experienced hikers had been swallowed by the wilderness before, their bodies discovered years later in remote locations where search teams had never thought to look. The Grand Teton ecosystem was vast and unforgiving, filled with hidden crevasses, sudden weather changes, and predators that could eliminate evidence of human presence with ruthless efficiency. The broken watch became not just a clue but a symbol of the mountain's indifference to human suffering, a reminder that experience and preparation were sometimes insufficient armor against the wilderness's casual cruelty. James found himself caught between grief and a growing sense that the official explanation, while logical, felt incomplete. He knew Sarah's habits, her obsessive preparation for even the simplest hikes, her almost supernatural ability to navigate by instinct when traditional methods failed. The idea that she could become so thoroughly lost within 500 meters of the parking lot challenged everything he understood about his wife's relationship with the mountains. Yet the alternative explanations were even more difficult to contemplate, involving possibilities too dark and random to accept. As days turned into weeks, the massive search operation gradually wound down, resources redirected to other emergencies and the daily business of park management. The command center was dismantled, the maps rolled up and filed away, the radio chatter that had provided constant background noise replaced by the natural sounds of wind through pine boughs and distant bird calls. The forest reclaimed its calm, leaving only the yellow tape around the discovery site as evidence of the human drama that had played out among the trees. The media attention that had initially drawn reporters from across the region began to fade as well, the story of the missing mother and child gradually displaced by fresher tragedies and more immediate concerns. Sarah and Leo's disappearance became a brief entry in the park's incident reports, a statistic in the annual summary of search and rescue operations, another cautionary tale shared around campfires about the importance of staying on marked trails and carrying proper emergency equipment. The broken watch, carefully catalogued and stored in an evidence locker, became a silent witness to mysteries that might never be fully understood. 4 years had transformed James Mitchell from a hopeful husband into a hollow shell of survival. His daily existence measured not in joy or accomplishment, but in the simple act of enduring another sunrise without the two people who had defined his world. The house in Jackson remained exactly as Sarah had left it that morning, her coffee mug still sitting in the sink, now permanently stained despite his periodic attempts to clean it. Leo's toys scattered across the living room floor in the same chaotic pattern they had held when a 3-year-old's attention had been captured by the promise of mountain adventure. James moved through these preserved spaces like a ghost, haunting his own life, touching familiar objects that had become relics of a happiness he could barely remember feeling. The official case files had been closed after 18 months of searching, the broken watch serving as both explanation and epitaph for Sarah and Leo's disappearance. The Grand Teton wilderness had claimed other victims in the intervening years, and Marcus Thorne had overseen dozens of successful rescues and several tragic recoveries, each one adding another layer to the professional calluses that protected his emotional core from the steady accumulation of human suffering. Yet there were nights when he still found himself staring at the topographical maps in his office, tracing possible routes with his finger, wondering if there was some combination of terrain and circumstance that his teams had overlooked, some secret the mountains were keeping that might explain how an experienced hiker and her child could simply vanish without a trace. The summer of the 4th year brought unusual weather patterns to the Teton Range, with record-breaking temperatures that sent rivers of meltwater cascading down granite faces and exposed geological features that had been hidden beneath permanent ice for decades. Climate scientists arrived to document the changing landscape, their research complicated by the stunning beauty of what they were witnessing, even as they recorded evidence of environmental catastrophe. The ancient ice revealed secrets trapped for millennia, occasionally disgorging artifacts from previous human expeditions, fragments of equipment that told stories of ambition and tragedy, dating back generations. It was in this context of revelation and loss that 2 experienced mountaineers, David Chen and Rebecca Martinez, found themselves attempting a technical ascent of the Grand Teton's north face, a route that had challenged climbers for decades, with its combination of steep rock, unpredictable weather, and sections that remained shrouded in permanent shadow even during the height of summer. Chen, a software engineer from Seattle with calloused hands and the lean build of someone who spent every free weekend on rock faces, had been planning this climb for 3 years, studying photographs, consulting with other climbers, and training on increasingly difficult routes to prepare for the physical and mental demands of the ascent. Martinez brought a different kind of expertise to the partnership, her background as a glaciologist giving her an intimate understanding of ice conditions and the subtle signs that indicated safe passage through crevassed terrain. She had spent the previous summer in Alaska studying the effects of warming temperatures on glacier stability, and her trained eye immediately recognized that the ice formations they encountered were behaving in ways that suggested fundamental changes in the mountain's structure. What should have been solid, predictable surfaces showed signs of stress and movement that made every anchor point a calculated risk. The discovery came on their second day of climbing, when an unexpected afternoon thunderstorm forced them to take shelter in a narrow chimney formation that provided protection from lightning while they waited for the weather to clear. The recent warm temperatures had melted away ice that had probably formed during the previous winter, revealing a deep fissure in the rock that extended further into the mountain than their headlamps could penetrate. Chen, whose curiosity had gotten him into trouble on previous climbs, began exploring the crack while Martinez monitored the storm's progress on her weather radio. Her attention divided between the static-filled reports and the need to keep track of her partner's movements. It was Chen's sharp intake of breath that first indicated he had found something unusual, his voice echoing strangely in the confined space as he called Martinez to examine what his light had illuminated deep within the fissure. Wedged into the crack at a depth that suggested it had been there for considerable time was an object that seemed completely out of place in the sterile environment of high-altitude rock and ice. A child's backpack, its bright blue fabric faded and torn, but still recognizable as something designed for small adventures and family hikes rather than technical mountaineering expeditions. The backpack was positioned in a way that suggested it had not simply fallen into the crevice, but had been deliberately placed there, wedged firmly between rock faces that would have required significant effort to access. Ice had formed around it in patterns that indicated multiple freeze-thaw cycles, and the fabric showed signs of prolonged exposure to moisture and temperature extremes. Yet despite the obvious damage, the backpack retained its essential structure. The reinforced straps and industrial zippers, testament to quality construction that had withstood conditions that would have destroyed lesser equipment. Martinez felt a chill that had nothing to do with the mountain air as she examined the discovery, her scientific mind immediately cataloging the implications, while her human heart recoiled from the possibilities it suggested. Children's equipment did not belong at this altitude, in this remote location where even experienced climbers rarely ventured. The backpack represented someone small and vulnerable, who had somehow ended up in a place where survival was measured in hours rather than days, where the margin for error was non-existent, and rescue was virtually impossible. The extraction of the backpack required careful planning and considerable risk, with Chen rappelling deeper into the fissure, while Martinez managed the rope systems from above. Both climbers acutely aware that a single mistake could turn their discovery into their own tragedy. The rock faces were wet from melted ice, making every handhold questionable, and the confined space made it difficult to maneuver the equipment needed to safely remove the backpack without damaging what might be crucial evidence. Chen's hands, normally steady and confident on the most challenging climbs, trembled slightly as he worked to free the object from its icy prison, his mind wrestling with questions about how it had come to be there and what its presence might mean. The successful retrieval of the backpack felt like a hollow victory, both climbers understanding instinctively that they had stumbled upon something that would demand answers neither of them was prepared to provide. Martinez carefully documented the exact location where they had found it, using her GPS unit to record coordinates that would allow investigators to return to the site, while Chen examined the backpack for any identifying information that might provide clues about its origin. The fabric was too damaged and faded to reveal manufacturer labels, but the size and style suggested it had been designed for a very young child, probably between 2 and 4 years old. The descent from the mountain took on an urgency that had nothing to do with weather or darkness, both climbers driven by the knowledge that they carried evidence of some past tragedy that demanded immediate attention from authorities. The backpack rode securely in Chen's main pack, wrapped in a spare tarp to protect it from further damage, its weight seeming disproportionate to its actual mass, as if the questions it represented had their own gravitational pull. Martinez found herself checking her radio constantly, eager for the moment when they would be back in range of cell towers and could report their discovery to park rangers who might be able to make sense of what they had found. The drive to the ranger station felt interminable, the mountain roads winding through scenery that normally filled both climbers with joy, but now seemed ominous and secretive, as if the landscape itself was complicit in whatever story the backpack represented. Chen gripped the steering wheel with white knuckles, his usual post-climb euphoria replaced by a growing sense of dread, while Martinez stared out the passenger window at the familiar peaks that had suddenly taken on an alien quality, their beauty transformed into something more complex and troubling. Marcus Thorne was completing paperwork in his office when the two climbers arrived, their urgent knocking interrupting his preparation for the end of another routine day. The sight of them, still wearing climbing harnesses and carrying the distinctive gear that marked them as serious mountaineers, immediately put him on alert, his years of experience having taught him that climbers who sought out rangers, after returning from the mountains, usually brought news that would complicate his evening plans. But nothing in his experience had prepared him for the moment when Martinez carefully unwrapped the small blue backpack and placed it on his desk, the faded fabric somehow radiating significance that made the air in the office feel heavy and charged. The recognition was immediate and visceral, hitting Marcus like a physical blow that left him momentarily unable to speak. He had seen this backpack before, had studied photographs of it during the intensive search operation 4 years earlier, had memorized every detail of its construction and appearance as part of his desperate attempt to find any trace of the missing mother and child. The sight of it now, damaged but unmistakably the same piece of equipment that had vanished along with Leo Mitchell, sent a chill down his spine that had nothing to do with air conditioning and everything to do with the sudden understanding that the case he thought had been closed was about to explode back into his life with implications he was only beginning to comprehend. The Wyoming State Crime Laboratory occupied a nondescript building in Cheyenne that bore no resemblance to the high-tech forensic facilities portrayed in television dramas, its sterile corridors and fluorescent lighting creating an atmosphere that felt more like a community college than the epicenter of criminal investigation. Dr. Elena Vasquez had worked in these unremarkable surroundings for 12 years, her expertise in textile analysis and material composition making her one of the most sought-after forensic specialists in the Mountain West. Her laboratory was a carefully organized chaos of microscopes, chemical testing equipment, and reference samples that represented decades of accumulated knowledge about fibers, fabrics, and the stories they could tell about human behavior. The blue backpack arrived on a Tuesday morning, transported in a climate-controlled evidence container that preserved its condition during the 4-hour drive from Grand Teton National Park. Marcus Thorne had personally overseen its packaging and transport, his hands trembling slightly as he filled out the chain of custody documentation that would track every moment of the backpack's journey through the investigative process. The weight of 4 years of unanswered questions seemed to settle on his shoulders as he watched the evidence disappear into the sterile environment of the crime lab, understanding that whatever Dr. Vasquez discovered might finally provide answers to mysteries that had haunted him through countless sleepless nights. Dr. Vasquez began her examination with the methodical precision that had made her reputation, photographing the backpack from every conceivable angle before beginning the delicate process of documenting each tear, stain, and structural detail that might provide clues about its history. The fabric showed extensive weathering consistent with prolonged exposure to extreme temperature variations, and the pattern of damage suggested that whatever had happened to its young owner had occurred in an environment where ice, rock, and possibly violence had combined to create a perfect storm of destructive forces. The initial examination revealed exactly what Marcus had expected: a child's hiking backpack that had endured years of harsh mountain conditions. Its bright blue fabric faded to a pale shadow of its original color, its zippers corroded by repeated freeze-thaw cycles that had introduced moisture into every seam and crevice. The manufacturer's labels had long since deteriorated beyond recognition, and the foam padding that had once provided comfort for small shoulders had compressed into hard lumps that bore the impression of whatever had been carried inside. These findings were consistent with the tragic accident theory that had dominated the official investigation, suggesting nothing more sinister than a child's equipment abandoned in an environment too harsh for human survival. It was during the detailed structural analysis that Dr. Vasquez made the discovery that would transform the entire case from a mountain rescue tragedy into something far more ominous. Hidden beneath the main compartment flap, secured to the backpack's internal frame with such skill that it had escaped detection by the climbers who found it, was a length of rope that immediately struck her as anomalous. The cord was approximately 18 inches long, its ends cut with the clean precision that suggested a sharp blade rather than the frayed appearance typical of rope that had been torn by natural forces. But it was the composition and construction of the rope itself that sent Dr. Vasquez reaching for her reference materials with hands that suddenly felt unsteady. Under high-powered magnification, the rope revealed a construction pattern that Dr. Vasquez recognized from her extensive database of military and tactical equipment samples. The fiber composition was a specialized blend of high-tensile nylon, that had been developed specifically for parachute applications. Its unique weave pattern designed to provide maximum strength while maintaining the flexibility required for rapid deployment under extreme stress. This was not the kind of rope that could be purchased at outdoor retailers or found in the equipment cache of even the most serious civilian mountaineers. It was military-grade material that required specialized suppliers and typically ended up in the hands of individuals with very specific training backgrounds. But even more revealing than the rope's composition was the manner in which it had been secured to the backpack's frame. The knotwork displayed a level of sophistication that went far beyond the simple techniques taught to recreational hikers or casual climbers. Dr. Vasquez compared the knot pattern to her extensive reference library of ropework techniques, her excitement growing as she identified elements that were distinctly military in origin. The primary knot was a modified prusik hitch that had been enhanced with additional wrapping patterns that significantly increased its holding strength while allowing for rapid adjustment under load. This was not the work of someone who had learned knot tying from books or weekend camping trips, but rather the practiced skill of an individual who had received formal military training in tactical rope work. The implications of these discoveries sent Dr. Vasquez immediately to her computer, where she began cross-referencing the rope specifications against military procurement databases that tracked the distribution of specialized equipment to various branches of the armed forces. The particular blend of nylon she had identified was manufactured by only 3 companies worldwide, and 2 of those had exclusive contracts with the United States military for parachute cord production. The paper trail led her through a maze of military suppliers and defense contractors, each step narrowing the possible sources until she arrived at a disturbing conclusion. This rope had been issued to either active-duty military personnel or veterans who had retained equipment from their service period. The knotwork provided even more specific clues about the individual who had secured the rope to the backpack. The technique used required not just military training, but specialized instruction in advanced tactical applications. Dr. Vasquez consulted with colleagues who had experience analyzing evidence from military crime scenes, and their assessment was unanimous. The person who had tied this knot had received training consistent with special operations forces, airborne units, or other elite military specializations, where rapid rope deployment and absolute reliability were matters of life and death. As Dr. Vasquez compiled her findings into a preliminary report, the fluorescent lights of her laboratory seemed to buzz with increased intensity, as if the building itself was reacting to the transformation taking place within its walls. What had begun as a routine analysis of hiking equipment had evolved into evidence of something far more sinister, a trail of clues that pointed toward premeditation, specialized knowledge, and the involvement of someone with the skills and equipment to execute a plan that had remained hidden for 4 years. The innocent blue backpack, once a symbol of childhood adventure, had become a silent witness to what appeared to be a carefully planned abduction. The completed forensic report would eventually run to 47 pages, filled with technical specifications, photographic evidence, and detailed comparisons that built an overwhelming case for the rope's military origins and the sophisticated nature of its deployment. But the most chilling element of Dr. Vasquez's analysis was her conclusion about the rope's purpose. The length and positioning suggested it had been used as a restraint system, designed to secure the backpack in a way that would prevent its loss while allowing for rapid transport across difficult terrain. The knotwork indicated someone who understood the critical importance of maintaining control over evidence, even while moving through challenging mountain environment where a single mistake could prove fatal. Marcus Thorne received Dr. Vasquez's preliminary findings via secure email at 6:47 on a Friday evening, the timing ensuring that he was alone in his office when the full impact of her discoveries hit him like a physical blow. He read through the technical analysis 3 times, each pass through the material making the implications more clear and more terrible. The case that had consumed 18 months of his professional life and 4 years of his private thoughts was about to explode back into public attention, with a violence that would dwarf the original search and rescue operation. The rope evidence meant that Sarah and Leo Mitchell had not simply gotten lost during a routine hiking trip. Someone with military training and specialized equipment had intercepted them, someone who possessed both the knowledge and the means to make them disappear so completely that months of intensive searching had failed to locate any meaningful traces. The broken watch, which had seemed like such a crucial breakthrough 4 years earlier, was now revealed as likely being part of an elaborate deception designed to misdirect the investigation away from the truth. Every assumption that had guided the original search would need to be re-examined in light of this new evidence. Every cleared grid square would need to be reconsidered as a potential crime scene. The transformation of the case from missing persons to kidnapping and probable murder would require a complete restructuring of the investigation, with resources and expertise that far exceeded anything available to the Grand Teton National Park Service. Federal authorities would need to be contacted, military databases would need to be searched, and every individual with the specialized training suggested by the rope evidence would need to be identified and investigated. The quiet mountain community that had gradually forgotten about the missing mother and child was about to be thrust back into the national spotlight, this time as the location of what appeared to be a meticulously planned and expertly executed crime. The blue backpack sat in its climate-controlled evidence locker, no longer just a piece of hiking equipment, but now the cornerstone of a criminal investigation that would reach into military records, psychological profiles, and the darkest possibilities of human behavior. The rope that had been so carefully hidden within its structure had finally told its story, revealing that the mountains of Grand Teton had been witness not to a tragic accident, but to something far more deliberate and infinitely more sinister. The transformation of the Mitchell case from cold missing persons file to active criminal investigation brought Marcus Thorne into a world he had never imagined entering during his decades of park service. The sterile conference rooms of federal buildings replaced the familiar comfort of his ranger station, and the topographical maps he knew by heart were joined by military service records, psychological profiles, and database printouts that chronicled the darker aspects of human behavior. Sleep became a luxury he could no longer afford as the investigation consumed 18-hour days that blurred together in a haze of coffee, fluorescent lighting, and the growing certainty that somewhere in the maze of information lay the identity of the person who had destroyed the Mitchell family. The rope evidence had opened doors that Marcus never knew existed, connecting him with military specialists whose expertise in tactical equipment and specialized training created a new vocabulary for his investigation. Colonel Sarah Martinez, a career military police officer on loan from Fort Carson, brought 23 years of experience in tracking down soldiers who had used their training for criminal purposes. Her angular features and steel-gray eyes reflected a professional demeanor that masked a deep personal commitment to ensuring that military skills were never perverted into tools of civilian harm. She arrived in Jackson with boxes of reference materials and a determination that matched Marcus's own desperate need for answers. The parachute cord analysis had been thorough, but Colonel Martinez pushed the investigation even deeper, utilizing military procurement databases that tracked every piece of specialized equipment issued to service members over the past 15 years. The particular specification of nylon found in the backpack had been part of a limited production run distributed exclusively to 3 elite units: the 82nd Airborne Division, the 10th Special Forces Group, and a classified Special Operations Unit, whose activities remained largely redacted in the files Marcus was cleared to access. This narrowed the pool of potential suspects from millions of military personnel to approximately 800 individuals who had direct access to this specific type of equipment. The knot analysis proved even more revealing than the rope composition. Colonel Martinez consulted with Master Sergeant Robert Hayes, a 30-year veteran of Army Special Operations whose expertise in tactical rope work had made him a sought-after instructor at military schools across the country. Sergeant Hayes examined the photographs of the knot with the intensity of a scholar studying ancient manuscripts, his weathered fingers tracing the rope patterns as he identified specific techniques that were taught only in advanced tactical courses. The combination of knots used indicated not just military training, but specialized instruction in rapid deployment scenarios, where failure could mean death for entire units. The psychological profile began taking shape through consultations with Dr. Amanda Ross, a forensic psychiatrist who specialized in military-related criminal behavior. Her experience with soldiers suffering from post-traumatic stress disorder had taught her to recognize the warning signs that sometimes preceded violent acting out, and the methodical nature of the Mitchell abduction suggested someone whose military training had been corrupted by psychological trauma. The careful planning, the sophisticated equipment usage, and the ability to remain undetected for years all pointed toward an individual who retained the tactical skills of their service while losing the moral framework that had once channeled those abilities toward protective rather than destructive purposes. The database searches consumed weeks of investigation, cross-referencing equipment assignments with geographic locations, service records with criminal histories, and psychological evaluations with current addresses. The computer algorithms churned through thousands of records, eliminating candidates who were deceased, incarcerated, or living in locations too distant from Grand Teton to be viable suspects. Slowly, the list contracted from hundreds to dozens to a handful of individuals whose backgrounds aligned with the evidence profile that had been so carefully constructed from the rope and knot analysis. John Malcolm McAllister emerged from this digital winnowing process like a ghost, materializing from shadow, his military record reading like a textbook case of how battlefield trauma could transform a decorated soldier into a dangerous recluse. His service with the 10th Special Forces Group had been exemplary for the first 8 years, with commendations for bravery, leadership, and technical expertise that had made him one of the unit's most reliable operators. But his final deployment to Afghanistan had ended with a medical evacuation, following an improvised explosive device attack that had killed 3 members of his team and left McAllister with traumatic brain injury, severe burns, and psychological wounds that military medicine had proven inadequate to heal. The transition to civilian life had been catastrophic for McAllister. A spiral of failed relationships, substance abuse, and increasing isolation that had been documented in a series of increasingly desperate reports from Veterans Administration counselors. His criminal record showed a pattern of escalating antisocial behavior. Bar fights that demonstrated his retained combat skills, domestic violence charges that revealed his inability to control rage, and finally a conviction for aggravated assault that had resulted in a suspended sentence contingent on his agreement to undergo intensive psychological treatment. The treatment had apparently been unsuccessful, as McAllister had simply disappeared from the system, his last known address being a cabin purchased with disability benefits in a remote area of western Wyoming. The cabin's location sent chills through Marcus when he saw it plotted on a detailed map of the Grand Teton region. McAllister's property sat on 40 acres of isolated forest land that bordered the national park, connected to public roads by a series of private logging trails that would allow someone familiar with the area to come and go without detection. The cabin itself was positioned to provide commanding views of the main hiking trails while remaining invisible from any public vantage point, a perfect observation post for someone who wanted to study the movement patterns of park visitors without being observed in return. The realization that McAllister had been living within striking distance of the park for the entire 4 years since the Mitchell disappearance added urgency to an investigation that had already consumed far too much time. Marcus found himself studying satellite images of the cabin with obsessive intensity, noting the defensive positioning, the multiple escape routes, and the careful placement of outbuildings that suggested someone who understood tactical principles and had applied them to civilian architecture. The property looked less like a home and more like a military installation, designed by someone who expected conflict and had prepared accordingly. The decision to obtain a search warrant required careful coordination between federal, state, and local authorities, with each jurisdiction bringing its own legal requirements and procedural complexities. The warrant application ran to 37 pages, documenting every piece of evidence, every analytical conclusion, and every logical connection that linked the rope evidence to McAllister's military background. Federal Judge Patricia Hendricks reviewed the application with the thoroughness that such cases demanded, her questions probing every assumption and challenging every inference until she was satisfied that probable cause had been established beyond any reasonable doubt. The planning session for the cabin raid took place in a conference room at the Teton County Sheriff's Department, with representatives from multiple agencies gathering around scaled drawings and satellite photographs that transformed McAllister's property into a tactical problem requiring military-style solutions. Sheriff Tom Bradley, whose department would provide local support and jurisdiction, brought 30 years of law enforcement experience, but acknowledged that his deputies had never faced a suspect with McAllister's specialized training and probable psychological instability. The FBI's tactical team would take the lead in the actual entry, supported by Wyoming State Police officers and Marcus's own park ranger colleagues who knew the terrain better than anyone else involved. The briefing materials painted a picture of a suspect who represented the worst-case scenario for law enforcement. Highly trained, psychologically unstable, intimately familiar with the local terrain, and quite possibly responsible for crimes that had demonstrated both meticulous planning and utter ruthlessness. The tactical team leader, Agent Jennifer Walsh, emphasized that McAllister's military background meant he would likely be prepared for exactly this type of operation, possibly with defensive measures that could include improvised explosive devices, hidden weapons caches, and escape routes that had been prepared and practiced over years of paranoid anticipation. Marcus spent the night before the raid sitting in his truck on a ridge overlooking the valley that contained McAllister's cabin, the distant lights barely visible through the dense forest that had provided concealment for whatever horrors had taken place in that remote location. 4 years of questions and sleepless nights had led to this moment, when the man responsible for destroying the Mitchell family would finally face justice for his crimes. The weight of James Mitchell's grief, of Leo's lost childhood, of Sarah's silenced voice seemed to press down on Marcus as he stared into the darkness, knowing that tomorrow would finally provide answers to mysteries that had haunted him through countless unsuccessful searches and futile investigations. The dawn brought with it a clarity that felt almost supernatural, the Wyoming sky painting itself in brilliant oranges and purples that seemed to promise resolution after years of uncertainty. The tactical teams moved into position with the precision of a military operation, their communications equipment crackling with updates as they surrounded the cabin that had remained hidden and secure for far too long. Marcus positioned himself at the command post, his ranger uniform feeling somehow inadequate among the tactical gear and military-grade equipment that surrounded him, but his presence serving as a reminder that this operation was fundamentally about protecting the wilderness and the people who came to find peace in its beauty. The final preparations were completed in an atmosphere of controlled tension, each team member understanding that they were about to confront someone whose psychological profile suggested he would not surrender quietly. McAllister's military training, combined with his apparent psychological deterioration and years of isolation, created a volatile combination that could explode into violence with minimal provocation. The raid would either end with a peaceful arrest and finally provide closure for the Mitchell case, or it would become another tragedy in a story that had already claimed too many innocent lives. The morning air carried an unseasonable chill as the tactical team approached McAllister's cabin through the dense forest of lodgepole pines and Douglas firs that had provided concealment for his activities over the past 4 years. Agent Jennifer Walsh moved with the fluid precision of someone whose body had been trained to navigate hostile territory, her eyes constantly scanning the tree line for signs of defensive preparations that might indicate an ambush or booby trap. The cabin itself emerged from the forest like a malevolent growth, its weathered wood siding and corrugated metal roof giving it the appearance of a structure that had been deliberately designed to blend with its surroundings, while harboring secrets too dark for daylight exposure. Marcus Thorne followed 20 yards behind the tactical team, his ranger uniform feeling inadequate among the military-grade equipment that surrounded him, but his presence necessary as the investigation's continuity and the voice of the victims who could no longer speak for themselves. His hands trembled slightly as he watched the systematic approach to a building that might finally contain answers to questions that had consumed 4 years of his life and robbed James Mitchell of everything that had given his existence meaning. The weight of Sarah and Leo's disappearance pressed down on Marcus like a physical force, making each step toward the cabin feel simultaneously urgent and terrifying. The absence of any response to the team's announced presence struck everyone as ominous, the silence from within the cabin suggesting either that McAllister had fled or that he was prepared to make a final stand that would add more violence to a case already steeped in tragedy. Agent Walsh's tactical experience told her that the most dangerous moments in operations like this occurred when suspects had time to prepare their responses, and McAllister's military background meant he possessed both the knowledge and likely the equipment to turn his cabin into a fortress that could exact a terrible price from anyone attempting to breach its defenses. The forced entry occurred with explosive suddenness, the tactical team's breaching charge, reducing the cabin's front door to splinters and smoke as armed officers poured through the opening with choreographed precision. The interior of the cabin revealed itself to be a testament to psychological deterioration and paranoid preparation, its walls covered with military surplus equipment, improvised weapons, and surveillance photographs that documented the movement patterns of park visitors over what appeared to be years of obsessive observation. Empty ammunition boxes and cleaning supplies for firearms created a smell of gun oil and chemical preservatives that mixed with the underlying odors of poor hygiene and rotting food, to create an atmosphere that seemed to embody mental illness made manifest. Marcus entered the cabin after the tactical team had secured the immediate area, his eyes taking in details that painted a picture of a man whose military discipline had been corrupted by psychological trauma into something predatory and dangerous. Maps of the Grand Teton Trail system covered one entire wall, marked with notations in McAllister's handwriting that tracked the daily routines of regular hikers, family groups, and solo adventurers who had unknowingly become subjects of surveillance by someone whose intentions could only be described as malevolent. Sarah and Leo's photographs appeared among these surveillance images, their smiling faces circled in red ink and annotated with dates and times that suggested McAllister had been watching them for weeks before their disappearance. The search of the main cabin areas yielded evidence of planning and preparation that chilled everyone who witnessed it. Detailed sketches of abduction scenarios, timing charts that mapped the blind spots in park ranger patrol patterns, and equipment caches that included restraints, sedatives, and tools whose purposes could only be imagined with horror. But it was the discovery of a concealed entrance to a basement area that transformed the investigation from evidence gathering into something approaching archaeological excavation of a crime scene that had been sealed away from the world for 4 devastating years. The basement entrance had been carefully camouflaged beneath a false floor that required crowbars and considerable effort to remove, its construction suggesting that McAllister had invested significant time and planning in creating a space that would remain hidden even from the most thorough searches. The smell that emerged when the concealment was finally breached hit the investigating team like a physical blow, a mixture of decay, chemicals, and something indefinably wrong that made several officers immediately retreat to the cabin's main level to regain their composure and prepare for whatever horrors awaited below. Marcus descended the crude wooden stairs, despite Agent Walsh's suggestion that he remain above ground until the forensic team could properly document and secure whatever lay in the basement's darkness. His flashlight beam cut through air that seemed thick with malevolence, illuminating stone foundation walls that had been modified with additional concrete work that looked disturbingly fresh and purposeful. The basement floor was a chaos of discarded containers, rotting fabric, and debris that suggested this space had been used for purposes that required concealment from the outside world, and easy cleanup of evidence that must never be allowed to surface. It was in the furthest corner of the basement, partially concealed beneath a tarp that had once been military-issue camouflage material, that Marcus's flashlight beam finally illuminated what remained of Sarah Mitchell after 4 years in conditions that had preserved her skeleton while destroying everything else that had made her the vibrant, capable woman who had left her house that morning, believing she was taking her son on a simple hiking adventure. The bones lay in a position that suggested her final moments had been spent in desperate struggle, her arms positioned defensively and her skull showing fractures that painted a picture of violence that no training could have prepared Marcus to witness. The forensic team's preliminary examination of Sarah's remains revealed evidence of trauma that went far beyond simple murder, suggesting that her death had not been quick or merciful, but rather the result of prolonged captivity that had ended only when her attempts to escape had finally triggered McAllister's explosive violence. The concrete modifications to the basement walls became horrifyingly clear, as restraint points and defensive measures designed to prevent exactly the kind of escape attempt that had apparently cost Sarah her life. The presence of additional concrete work suggested that this basement had been used for multiple victims over time, making Sarah and Leo potentially the most recent in a series of disappearances that might stretch back years. But the discovery that sent chills through every member of the investigation team was the complete absence of any trace of Leo's remains anywhere in the cabin or its immediate surroundings. The basement that had become Sarah's tomb contained no evidence of the 3-year-old boy who had vanished along with his mother. No clothing fragments, no toys, no bones that would have suggested he had shared his mother's fate in McAllister's carefully concealed chamber of horrors. The implications of Leo's absence created questions that were almost too terrible to contemplate, suggesting scenarios that ranged from mercy killing to human trafficking to possibilities that the investigators' training had not prepared them to consider. The search of the cabin's exterior areas revealed additional evidence of McAllister's methodical approach to his crimes, including freshly disturbed earth that suggested multiple burial sites and a workshop area where he had apparently modified equipment for purposes that became clear only when viewed in the context of the surveillance materials and restraint systems found throughout the property. The blue backpack's deliberate placement in the remote crevice was revealed as part of a sophisticated misdirection campaign, designed to focus search efforts away from the true crime scene, while creating the impression of a hiking accident that would eventually be written off as another wilderness tragedy. The investigation team's documentation of the crime scene consumed 18 hours of meticulous photography, measurement, and evidence collection that transformed McAllister's cabin into a cataloged monument to human evil. Each piece of evidence told part of a story that painted Sarah's final weeks as a nightmare of captivity, and terror that had ended only with her death. While Leo's fate remained a mystery that seemed to grow more ominous with each hour that passed without discovering any trace of the missing child. Marcus emerged from the cabin as evening shadows lengthened across the Wyoming landscape, his face bearing the expression of someone who had looked into an abyss of human behavior that no amount of wilderness experience could have prepared him to understand. The justice that Sarah had finally received felt hollow when weighed against the continued mystery of her son's disappearance, and the terrible knowledge that McAllister's crimes might extend far beyond the Mitchell family to include other victims whose disappearances had never been connected to the isolated cabin that had harbored such unspeakable secrets. The media attention that would inevitably follow the discovery would bring renewed focus to Leo's case, but it would also force James Mitchell to confront the brutal details of his wife's final days while still facing the agonizing uncertainty about his son's fate. The cabin had yielded answers to some questions while creating new ones that might prove even more difficult to resolve, transforming a missing persons case into a murder investigation that still left a 3-year-old child's disappearance as an open wound that might never heal. The Wyoming evening air felt cleaner after hours spent in the contaminated atmosphere of McAllister's basement, but Marcus knew that the images and smells of what they had discovered would haunt everyone involved in the investigation for the rest of their lives. Sarah Mitchell had finally been found, but her son remained lost somewhere in a story that had revealed itself to be far more complex and horrifying than anyone had imagined possible. The search for Leo would continue, but now it would be guided by the terrible knowledge of what his mother had endured, and the growing certainty that McAllister's secrets extended far beyond what had been discovered in the cabin's hidden basement. The fluorescent lights in the interrogation room at the Teton County Sheriff's Department cast harsh shadows across John McAllister's weathered face, revealing the toll that 4 years of isolation and psychological deterioration had taken on a man who had once been considered one of the military's most reliable operators. His hands, secured to the metal table with restraints that bore witness to his continued potential for violence, trembled with what could have been withdrawal, fear, or the simple physical manifestation of a mind that had finally been cornered after years of successfully evading consequences for unspeakable actions. Agent Jennifer Walsh sat across from McAllister with the patience of a predator who had finally trapped her prey. Her years of experience in extracting confessions from military personnel who had crossed moral boundaries serving her well in this most crucial of interrogations. The evidence collected from the cabin created an overwhelming case against McAllister, but the location of Leo Mitchell remained the single most important piece of information that only he possessed. The weight of a 3-year-old boy's fate rested on Walsh's ability to navigate the psychological minefield of a damaged veteran's mind and extract the truth from someone who had spent years perfecting the art of deception. Marcus Thorne watched the interrogation from an observation room where monitors displayed multiple camera angles of McAllister's every gesture and facial expression. His own hands clenched into fists as he fought the urge to burst through the door and demand immediate answers about Leo's whereabouts. 4 years of sleepless nights, 18 months of intensive searching, and the horrific discovery of Sarah's remains had led to this moment when the man responsible would finally be forced to account for his crimes. Yet even as justice seemed within reach, the uncertainty about Leo's fate made victory feel hollow and incomplete. The confession began as a trickle of admissions that gradually expanded into a torrent of details that painted a picture of premeditation and psychological manipulation that chilled everyone who heard them. McAllister's military training had taught him patience, observation, and tactical planning, skills that he had perverted into a methodology for stalking and abducting innocent victims who had done nothing more than seek the peace and beauty of the wilderness. His surveillance of the Mitchell family had extended over weeks, documenting their routines, learning their habits, and identifying the perfect moment when they would be vulnerable and isolated from potential help. The actual abduction had occurred within sight of the parking area where James Mitchell waited for his family's return, McAllister having positioned himself along a switchback in the trail where natural terrain features provided concealment from casual observation. Sarah's experience as a hiker had made her immediately suspicious when McAllister approached them with a fabricated story about injured climbers who needed assistance, but her concern for others' welfare had overcome her instincts just long enough for him to close the distance and deploy the restraints and sedatives he had prepared for exactly this scenario. The broken watch had indeed been deliberate misdirection, McAllister having damaged it during the initial struggle, and then positioned it along the trail to create evidence of an accident that would focus search efforts in completely wrong direction. His understanding of search and rescue protocols, gained through military training and years of observing Park Service operations, had allowed him to anticipate exactly how investigators would interpret the evidence and plan their response accordingly. The watch had served its purpose perfectly, consuming precious time and resources while he transported his victims to the isolated cabin where he could operate without fear of discovery. Sarah's captivity had lasted 3 weeks, during which McAllister's psychological instability had manifested in increasingly erratic behavior that had ultimately led to the violence that ended her life. Her attempts to escape had been both brave and desperate, fueled by a mother's determination to return to her family and protect her child from further harm. The concrete modifications to the basement had been specifically designed to prevent such attempts, but Sarah's mountaineering experience had given her skills in problem-solving and physical manipulation that McAllister had not anticipated when he designed his prison. But it was McAllister's revelation about Leo's fate that transformed the interrogation from an exercise in documenting past crimes into a desperate race against time to save a life that might still hang in the balance. According to his confession, Leo had been separated from his mother early in their captivity, McAllister's fractured psychology unable to cope with the child's constant crying and demands for his mother. Rather than harm the boy directly, McAllister claimed he had transported Leo to a remote backcountry shelter approximately 15 miles from the cabin, leaving him with supplies and instructions to wait for rescue that McAllister knew would never come through official channels. The location McAllister described was the old Cascade Canyon Emergency Shelter, a stone structure built by the Civilian Conservation Corps in the 1930s that had been abandoned by the Park Service decades earlier, but remained intact due to its robust construction and isolated location. The shelter sat at the confluence of 2 seasonal streams in an area that was rarely visited even by experienced backpackers, accessible only through unmarked game trails that required intimate knowledge of the terrain to navigate safely. If Leo had indeed been left there 4 years earlier, his survival would have depended on factors too numerous and uncertain to calculate with any confidence. The search operation that followed McAllister's confession represented the most intensive effort ever mounted in Grand Teton National Park, with resources drawn from multiple agencies and volunteer organizations who understood that they might be racing against time to save a child who had already endured 4 years of unimaginable hardship. Marcus led the effort with desperate energy, his knowledge of the park's hidden areas and abandoned structures making him indispensable to an operation that would require both technical expertise and intuitive understanding of how a frightened child might have survived in the wilderness. The approach to the Cascade Canyon shelter required a grueling 8-hour hike through terrain that challenged even experienced mountaineers, the searchers carrying equipment that included medical supplies, communication gear, and child psychology specialists who could provide immediate support if Leo was indeed found alive. The psychological impact of 4 years of isolation on a child who had been 3 years old when abandoned was beyond anyone's ability to predict. But the searchers prepared for scenarios that ranged from complete catatonia to aggressive fear responses that might make rescue attempts dangerous for everyone involved. The shelter emerged from the forest like a monument to abandonment, its stone walls weathered by decades of mountain storms, but still structurally sound enough to have provided protection for someone who knew how to utilize its resources. The heavy wooden door hung askew on rusted hinges, and the interior darkness seemed to absorb the searchers' flashlight beams, as if the building itself was reluctant to reveal whatever secrets it might contain. Marcus approached the structure with hands that trembled from exhaustion and emotional overload, knowing that the next few moments would either provide the miracle that James Mitchell had prayed for during 4 years of anguish, or confirm that Leo's story had ended in tragedy too terrible to fully comprehend. The interior of the shelter showed clear signs of recent habitation, with makeshift bedding constructed from materials that could have been left by McAllister or accumulated by Leo during his time alone in the wilderness. Food containers bore labels that suggested they had been placed deliberately rather than left by casual visitors, and the arrangement of furniture and supplies indicated an intelligence at work that seemed consistent with a child who had learned to adapt to circumstances beyond his control. But Leo himself was nowhere to be found, his absence creating questions that seemed to multiply with each piece of evidence that suggested he had indeed survived his abandonment. The expanded search of the area around the shelter revealed signs of a presence that had existed for an extended period. Paths worn through the undergrowth that suggested regular travel patterns, improvised tools that demonstrated resourcefulness born of necessity, and food caches that indicated someone who understood the importance of preparation for seasonal changes in weather and food availability. These discoveries painted a picture of survival that seemed almost impossible for a child who had been barely 3 years old when left alone in the wilderness. Yet the evidence was undeniable, and suggested that Leo's story might be far more complex than anyone had imagined. The search teams fanned out from the shelter in patterns that covered every possible direction Leo might have traveled, their calls echoing through canyons and valleys that had remained silent for decades, except for the sounds of wind and wildlife. Each team carried photographs of Leo taken shortly before his disappearance, though everyone understood that 4 years of wilderness survival would have changed him beyond easy recognition. The boy they were seeking might bear little resemblance to the smiling toddler in the pictures, transformed by experiences that would have challenged adults, and might have created a person who was more wild animal than civilized child. As the hours passed without contact, the initial hope that had energized the searchers began to give way to a more complex mixture of emotions that included both determination and growing uncertainty about what Leo's discovery might actually mean for his future. If he had indeed survived 4 years alone in the wilderness, his reintegration into human society would present challenges that no one was prepared to address. The psychological trauma of abandonment, combined with years of isolation and self-reliance, might have created a person who was unable or unwilling to return to the civilization he had been torn from The media attention that surrounded the search operation brought both resources and complications, with reporters and camera crews transforming the remote wilderness into a circus of speculation and sensationalism that threatened to overshadow the human drama at the story's. James Mitchell arrived at the command post with hope and fear warring in his eyes, his 4 years of grief and uncertainty culminating in a moment when he might finally learn his son's fate, or be forced to accept that some mysteries would never be fully resolved. As evening approached and the search teams prepared to establish overnight camps that would allow them to continue their efforts at first light, the question of Leo's survival hung over the operation like a presence that could be felt but never fully grasped. The evidence suggested he had lived far longer than anyone had thought possible, but his current location and condition remained mysteries that might require days or weeks of searching to resolve. The wilderness that had once seemed beautiful and peaceful now appeared vast and secretive, capable of hiding a young boy who might have learned to avoid human contact after years of learning to trust only himself for survival. The story that had begun with a simple family hike had evolved into something far more complex and troubling than anyone could have anticipated, its conclusion remaining tantalizingly out of reach, even as the truth about Sarah's fate had finally been revealed. Leo Mitchell had become something between reality and legend, a symbol of both human resilience and the terrible price that innocence sometimes pays for the evil that walks among us. Whether he would ever be found, and what kind of person he might have become during his years alone in the wilderness, remained questions that haunted everyone involved in the search, and left the public wondering if some stories are destined to end with uncertainty rather than resolution. We want to hear your opinion about this thrilling story. What do you think will happen with them? Tell us your name, where you are watching from. Don't forget to like and subscribe to the channel so you don't miss the new stories coming up. See you next time.